The topic today is the perennial issue of lying in politics, and I want to at least impart to you what I think may be the truth about lying in politics. And I first became interested in this issue a good decade ago, but not during the years of George W. Bush. It was fascinating because when I wrote the book that came out of this, a book called The Virtues of Mendacity, virtually everybody assumed that I became interested after the invasion of Iraq, when the weapons of mass destruction that were the premise for the invasion were exposed as a fabrication. And people assumed that Bush and all of the lies that he told to justify that war had piqued my interest. But in fact, it had been piqued a few years earlier when the London Review of Books asked me to review a book by Christopher Hitchens called No One Left to Lie To, a book which was about then-President Bill Clinton. And the phrase "no one left to lie to" had been applied to Clinton by one of his critics who said he had lied to this person, to that person, to this official, to that, and there was just no one left to lie to, that he was such an inveterate liar. And what this alerted me to was the fact that no matter which political party, no matter left or right, or which particular figure, the issue of lying in politics and the ability to accuse your enemy of being a liar, this was such a ubiquitous and perennial aspect of politics that it involved something that seemed to me in a way inherent in the realm that we call the political, inherent in something that is in the DNA of politics itself. And one might argue there are three reactions you could have to that discovery. The first is to be disgusted with politics, to withdraw from politics, to assume that politics is a dirty game, politicians are all corrupt, and therefore one retreats into some other realm, the aesthetic realm, religion. One escapes from this dirty world. That's one response. The second is the campaign, often moralistic, to reform politics. To clean up politics, to get rid of the scoundrels, to create a moral politics which will be somehow without deception, without lying, a politics of full transparency. And this, of course, is tried periodically, and it succeeds to some extent, but then there's always a regression to a more, let's call it, normal politics in which the truth is bent and a certain amount of hypocrisy and deception becomes, once again, routine. So the third approach, and the one that basically I guess I took in the book, was to think about politics and lying as something that involved a functional dimension of this realm that we call the political, that the prevalence of hypocrisy and deception, mendacity and lying, in the political realm somehow was doing work that was, of course, in many cases negative, but in some cases perhaps positive. And then I began to reflect on the ways in which, in the American context in particular, anxiety about lying has been a very, very powerful presence from the very beginning. Many of you, I'm sure, know the story of George Washington and the cherry tree. It's a story that was depicted in a painting that I put on the front of the book by Grant Wood. The story, for those of you who don't know it, involves the young George Washington, who, when asked by his father if he had chopped down a cherry tree, said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I did it." And he admitted that he had chopped it down. And the father says to George Washington, "Son, I am so impressed by your honesty, so impressed by the fact that you're willing to confess this crime, that I forgive you." And as a result, George Washington became the epitome of the truthful politician, the honest politician. Now, the irony of this is it turns out that this is entirely a myth, a fable, itself a lie, made up by Parson Mason Weems in the 1806 edition of his hagiographic biography of Washington. So the founding myth of American politics is the myth that our leader, George Washington, was completely honest. But we've maintained this as a powerful self-image, that American politics was set against a corrupt and mendacious politics in Europe. So the United States was born against a British politics that was understood to be aristocratic, understood to be basically filled with people who used language deceptively, were using a high diction that was essentially rhetorically dubious and duplicitous, and that Americans, on the other hand, were straight-talking, plain-speaking. Were able to tell it like it was, didn't have the polish, didn't have the politesse, the politeness of the aristocratic society of the Europe from which they had so eagerly fled. It was also America that was hostile to the tradition of Machiavellianism. And in the early American experience, there was a great deal of demonizing of Machiavelli as the man who had taught a politics that was not what we were going to follow. Machiavelli became a kind of target of a certain American sense of innocence, purity, honesty, and so forth. This was reinforced by one of the major religious strains in the early colonial American experience, that of Puritanism, which was very powerful, especially, of course, in the Northeast. And the Puritans were very, very anxious to separate themselves from the Catholic tradition, which was a tradition of casuistry and tradition of secrecy. They were very anxious to get rid of the monastic tradition where people hid from the world, and instead believed in a kind of communal transparency, the holy watching, they called it, of other people. The idea somehow that everybody was available to be scrutinized. And this was a politics of mutual surveillance, we might say, a politics in which the surface was supposed to reflect the depth rather than to hide it. So American politics from the get-go, we might say, from the very beginning, was a politics that prided itself, maybe it was fooling itself, but prided itself on being more truthful, more plain-speaking, less, in a way, rhetorically aristocratic than European politics. And I could give you many examples along the way of how this has been manifest. For example, in some of the hostility to politics in the 20th century by people who wanted a technocratic elite to run the show because they distrusted a kind of political machinations and wanted to have only scientists running things. We could talk about the importance of the lie detector in American politics, at least for a while, not at the moment. We could talk about a number of other examples. In the book, I discuss the popularity of George Orwell. Of course, it's English, but had an essay called Politics in the English Language, which was extraordinarily popular in the United States in the post-World War II period, an essay which attacked what he saw as mendacious rhetoric in politics. And it just occurred to me, actually, as I was preparing this talk, that we can even see its effects today in the figure of Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, in many ways, is himself a kind of figure of absolute self-invention, a kind of utterly false and inauthentic figure. But curiously, his popularity in certain quarters in the United States is due to the idea that he is a plain truth teller, that he doesn't follow the politesse, the politeness that we now call, or he calls, political correctness, that he will say things about, say, Mexican immigrants in the United States that other people may be thinking, even racist thoughts, but he will say them. And this makes him somehow, for some people, authentic and heroic. I mean, the great irony is that he, of course, is one of the people who pushed the idea that Obama was not born in the United States, a kind of crazy notion, which is an absolute lie. So I'm not saying that in any way he really is a truth teller, but his appeal for some people is the fact that he is speaking from the gut, speaking not with the filter of political rhetoric. So in any event, the American experience has been one in which a certain overvalorization, we might say, of political honesty and a critique of mendacity has been very, very prevalent. During the Bush years, however, there was a growing anxiety, and it's an anxiety which was manifest in many different ways, about the ways in which politics had become, and this is always difficult to think of in terms of a real development rather than a fantasized change from what had been the case before, but had become more and more a politics of dissimulation, of spin, of what the comedian Stephen Colbert called truthiness. And so we heard lots of fairly clever remarks about politicians. When can you tell when a politician is lying? And the answer is when he moves his lips. Or when can you tell when a politician commits a gaffe in politics? And the answer is when he tells the truth. Or the one that I like the best, and this will resonate with people of at least my age, what's the difference between George Washington, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan? Washington could never tell a lie, Richard Nixon could never tell the truth, and Ronald Reagan could never tell the difference. So there was a certain sort of growing cynicism, we might say, about the role of mendacity in politics. So in any event, what I set out to do in this project was to figure out what role lying might play. And of course, one can begin before the political realm, looking at the role that lying plays in socialization, looking at the role that lying, or deception at least, plays in nature, looking at the conflicts in moral discourse, looking at the relationship between language and the lie. All of these are things that I begin to do in the book before I move to the political realm. But what fascinated me was the extent to which this special realm, this special boundaried area called the political, could be seen as, let's say, tendentially more hospitable to mendacity than certain other realms of human endeavor. Now, I don't want to argue that all politics favors the lie, and that most politicians lie rather than tell the truth, because a lie only works against the backdrop of the assumption of truth-telling. A lie works if you assume the person is indeed telling the truth, and most politicians, like the rest of us, operate under that assumption. So lying may be, let's say, more frequently found in the political realm than elsewhere, perhaps, but it is nonetheless not the default position. It's not the dominant position. I don't want to be understood to be arguing that. But nonetheless, it exists frequently in ways that make us wonder what makes this realm of the political so open to the prevalence of hypocrisy, deception, mendacity, and outright lying. To begin to answer this, one has to think very hard about what we mean by the political realm itself. Back in the 1920s, there was a German theorist, Carl Schmitt, who wrote a book called The Concept of the Political. Very complicated argument. He was very right-wing, later became a supporter of the Nazis. The book itself makes the argument that politics ought not to be confused with other realms, economics, morality, religion, the aesthetic. Politics was a realm entirely set apart. Something that had been argued perhaps as early as Machiavelli, the first one to argue that politics was autonomous and not to be understood in terms of its being essentially part of religion or society in general. And Schmitt then said, well, what is the concept of the political? And his claim was the political is essentially the relation between friends and foes, friends and enemies. And that this antagonism was the essence of the political. And therefore liberalism, which looked for cooperation and argued for security, this was not really political. I want to get back to this and try to explain what he meant by it a little bit more when I look at aspects of the political in relation to lying, but this at least was the first attempt in the 20th century to isolate the concept of the political and see it as separate from other realms of human endeavor. Later theorists like Hannah Arendt, German-born but basically made her career in the United States, also argued for the special quality of the political realm, different from the social, having to do with great deeds in the public space, having to do with action, having to do with freedom, very different from the getting and spending of the household, very different from labor, very different from the world of making objects, something that became an end in itself, something that was worth preserving in a democracy. So very different from Schmitt's antagonistic concept. He was pluralist. It was a version of the political in which people argued, people basically did not fight in the same way they did with the Schmitt existentialist struggle. But the point being that there was a realm, a space, a thing called the political which was separate enough that it was worth preserving against attempts to reduce it to the religious or the moral or the economic or whatever was outside it. The next question is there a space for the political? I mean, sometimes people have argued literally that there is a space, whether it be the agora in the ancient polis, the kind of marketplace where people came together to talk, or the space that we associate with, say, the modern state, a legislative space, a space where politics in the high level, whatever we mean by high, takes place, different from, say, the household, different from the university, different from other institutions of society. And sometimes we actually think of this as a literal space. So we talk about the Kremlin or the White House or Westminster, and I'm sure in Chile there are various versions of the same thing where we use a space to define the executive function or the legislative function. And this too, sometimes is a protected space, a space in which it's possible to do certain things that you can't do elsewhere. So for example, in the United States, in the Constitution, it's possible for politicians in the Congress of the United States to say things that are in fact untrue, that are libelous even, and not be prosecuted for libel. That they have, as it were, a protected space in which they're able to say what needs to be said without being afraid of being sued. So there is a way in which this space literally is a protected area for a certain kind of even mendacious speech. All right, so this is one sort of beginning issue. Is there a place called the political? Is there something that is essentially political? And then the next question is, of course, how do we define it? How do we make sense of this alleged separate space? So I mentioned Schmitt, concept of the political, basically politics as antagonism, even an existential struggle. And here, the model really is international politics at its most aggressive, that is to say, war. So if war is politics continued by other means, as Clausewitz famously said, there is a way in which the political, understood in terms of war as the stream example, is basically a struggle for existential survival between two entities, call them states or communities or nations, that are fighting in such a way that there really is a life or death implication. One version of the political, antagonism. And occasionally, of course, this manifests itself internally with civil war and with other attempts. Terrorism might be understood in these terms in which violence is used for political ends. A somewhat more benign version of this, but still in the level of international politics, is what is sometimes called the politics of agonism. Not antagonism, but agonism. Here the politics is one of adversarial relations, of relations of competition, rivalries. You're not collaborating, you're basically in a kind of struggle, but not an existential struggle, where violence is part of the game. So diplomatic relations among countries, often friendly, but the United States and China, or you can think of your own local examples. Does Chile always have good relations with Bolivia or Argentina, whatever? There's always a sense of the potential rivalry, which may occasionally lead to violence, but most of the time does not. And so this is a version of politics, and Chantal Mouffe, the Belgian theorist, has made this the centerpiece of her version of the political. Politics is always a dissensus, not a consensus, a dissensus and a struggle, one that's never ending, one that involves using sometimes any means necessary. And so diplomacy and international relations, this is a version of the political. Moving towards internal politics, there are a number of versions of the political that one can consider before we get to the idea of the relationship between lying and politics. One is the notion of basically the rule of the wise, the rule of either technocrats or philosopher kings or some sort of elite that is trained basically to rule. And one can think of this part of the Platonic Republic. There are many other examples of a version of politics is basically the rule of those who know, those who have the interests of the polity at mind, those who are trained to be the leaders. An authoritarian politics, whether it be an enlightened despotism or not so enlightened, it's top-down. The rule of the wise. And this is certainly one version of politics, and it's one that if you think about human experience has been very, very prevalent in many, many contexts for a long period of time. A second version of the political we might call the Republican tradition. tradition, and Machiavelli is one of its founders, but there are other figures later, like James Harrington in Britain, or Rousseau for that matter, more recent ones as well, who follow this Republican tradition. There's a great book by John Pocock on the importance of the Republican tradition in the founding of the United States. This is a tradition in which the citizenry, instead of being passive, as it is when there is the rule of the wise, is active. It's a politics of participation, a politics of civic humanism, a politics in which all of us are construed as free when we are active in the political realm, a politics that we associate with a strong demos, a strong democratic people in which there is a great deal, we might say, of active participation. This is what Hannah Arendt favored when she looked at the ancient Greek polis as a space for strong political action in a way that led to freedom. Very, very powerful notion of political, often one that is more an aspiration than realized in actual fact. You know, the council movement, there are various attempts to be direct democracies. Most of the time we live in representative democracies, but nonetheless the goal of having greater and greater participation. The Republican tradition is very powerful. There are also other traditions, the liberal tradition, for example, in which politics is basically politics of a kind of guardianship for other interests, economic or individual, a politics in which the state is seen as, if not the enemy, at least seen with suspicion. A politics which emphasizes human rights against the rights of the citizen, against the rights of the state, against the rights of the ruling elite. It's a politics that, in a way, some people would argue is a very thin politics. Even some would claim an anti-politics. So all of these, we might say, are versions of the political. There's also another, we might say, way to get into this, to think about the political, which I try to approach in the book, which goes in a slightly different direction. It's sort of athwart these different types. The international type of antagonism or agonism, the internal types of the Republican tradition, the tradition of the rule of the wise, or the tradition of liberalism. And that's the relationship between politics and the aesthetic. Now, I want to pause for a moment with this, because this is a very complicated issue. The idea that politics is like the aesthetic, or that politics can be aestheticized, causes a lot of people to be very nervous. Walter Benjamin, the great German critic, in an essay he wrote back in the 1930s, said that fascism meant the aestheticization of the political. He argued that communism meant the politicization of the aesthetic, that's something else, but the aestheticization of the political. And what did he mean by this? He meant that basically politics was an aesthetic spectacle in which we were not really participants, but sort of numbed observers, fascinated by the violence, fascinated by the show in front of us, fascinated by all of the ways in which politics entertained us, but we did not really participate. It was not a politics for us. It was a politics that was a politics of mystification. And so the relation between the aesthetic and the political is often tainted with the sense that it means a politics of image rather than substance, of spectacle rather than involvement. There are other negative connotations to the idea of the relation between the aesthetic and the political. One of the most powerful is the idea that the political, and especially the state, should be like a work of art. That is to say, should be like an organic totality, one version of the work of art, should be like a formally beautiful object created by some wise legislator or someone who basically is able to shape it the way an artist shapes his or her work of art. Now here too, there's generally a resistance, because what this involves, some people will argue, is a kind of violence, that to form something is inherently to coerce it, to create out of the muddle of the world, to create out of the chaos of the world something that is like a beautiful form, which may be okay in the world of art, although some people will argue against organic form, but in the world of politics, well, it has its costs. And people have pointed to the way in which, for example, Mussolini once argued that he felt like the people, the masses, were like clay in his hands, and he was the great sculptor molding them. And there's some way in which this gives the artist who creates the organic form a kind of, let's say, dominating power, which some people have found problematic. So these are what we might call negative connotations of the relation between the aesthetic and the political. And some people try to separate the political from the aesthetic because of this. But there are other ways in which the political and the aesthetic can, I think, be more interestingly connected in ways that suggest a more interesting version of the political. One way to think about it is to get away from the idea of politics as the making of an object, the state as an organic form, and instead think of politics as a performance, not a work of art that is an enduring work, but as an ongoing performance. And we know that the political realm is a realm in which certain kinds of figures are figures that we follow as if they were in a drama, as if they were on a stage. And we talk about playing politics. Now, we usually mean that in a somewhat negative sense. He's just playing politics. But the fact is that politics has a strong performative dimension. Leadership, the sense of responsibility, the sense of achievement. We often assume that there's a hero, there are villains, the people we're opposing. Politics has various dramatic forms, tragic, satirical, comic if the ending is good, and so forth. So that we often see the political as if it were performative. There's also another, and this is a very complicated relationship, between fictionality, the aesthetics of what we might call make-believe or creativity, and the way in which politics also, to a certain extent, is a politics of creativity, of improvisation, of creation. So obviously, in the realm of the aesthetic, one of the things that we privilege is the idea that there is the capacity to create something different, to create out of what is what might be more beautiful, more, in a way, challenging, the various terms we use to talk about what the aesthetic realm can produce. Politics is also, to some extent, not only the politics of conservation, but the politics of innovation and creation. And so to this extent, politics can be seen, like the aesthetic, as something that produces something unexpected into the world. Hannah Arendt talked about natality or birth, the idea that something was not simply there, but was part of the introduction of newness, of creative, let's call it interruption in the everyday. Now, in addition to this, there's also, and this is a much more, let's say, convoluted argument, another aesthetic dimension, which we might call a symbolic dimension of the political, which is, and I want to take a moment to kind of parenthesis, which is best understood by going back to a certain version of medieval European politics that was first introduced, at least to the historical world, by Ernst Kantorowicz. Ernst Kantorowicz, German-born, came to the United States, taught at Berkeley and Princeton, and wrote a book called The King's Two Bodies. I'm sure any of you who study European history will know it well. The basic argument of the book is that there was in Christianity a notion of the literal body of, let's say, the man, God, Jesus, and then the corpus mysticum, the mystical body. The literal body, the material body, the creaturely body, the finite body, dies on the cross. The corpus mysticum, the mysterious, mystical body, is eternal, is part of God. Now, this division between these two bodies is then transferred to the medieval church. So a pope or a figure in the church is finite, will basically fill the office for a while, but the papacy endures. And then what makes it even more important for politics is that this becomes available for the notion of kingship. So the king's two bodies are precisely like the corpus mysticum and the finite creaturely body of Christ. There is the institution of kingship, which survives. And then there is the individual mortal king who lives and then dies. So as the French say, le roi est mort, vive le roi. The individual king is dead, but long live the king, because the kingship endures. Now, it's often argued that this notion of the two bodies ends with the ending of medieval feudal kingship. But it has been argued recently by several French theorists, Claude Lefort, Pierre Rosanvallon, and a Dutch theorist, Frank Ankersmit, that there have been versions of the two bodies argument, even in contemporary democratic politics. And here the relevant term is the people. When one asks the question, what is popular sovereignty? What is the general will, as Rousseau asked, of the people? We end up with two different, in a way, answers. One is that the people is basically more than the population. It's the active citizenry. It's everybody who is part of a demos, not necessarily ethnically understood, but part of the citizenship of a country. But then if we ask empirically who embodies, represents, claims to be the people, it's almost always a partial group. It's almost always a group that claims to speak for the people. So in the United States today, the right-wing Tea Party movement will constantly say, we are the people, that we represent the people who are forgotten. We represent the real people. The left-wing Occupy movement will say, no, 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 we are the people. So there is, in other words, a struggle between this mystical notion of the people with a capital P and the embodiment which may be claimed by various groups. And we see a certain, let's call it substitutionism as part of this. And in the Marxist tradition, you see it with the Leninist Vanguard Party substituting for the proletariat. There are various other versions of this. Now, why is this relevant? It's relevant because there is a gap between the symbolic, let's call it the aesthetic notion of the people or the king or whatever institution endures, like the corpus mysticum, and the concrete embodiments, the finite king who dies, or the group that claims to represent the people. So that one might say in this version of politics, there is always a gap between the symbolic and the real. And people like Claude Lefort interestingly argued that an attempt to collapse that gap, to believe that somehow one group really was the corpus mysticum, really was the people, led to totalitarianism. The totalitarianism, broadly understood, was precisely an assumption that there was an absolute unity between the leader, the party, the movement, and the people, all as if they were absolutely one, as if the real presence in the Eucharist were really politically available. And he argues, and others like him, that we have to keep, in fact, the gap between the people and who may claim to represent it. And this introduces a certain aesthetic notion that politics is a kind of fiction, even democratic politics, because the demos, the people, doesn't really exist except on this basically conceptual or metaphoric or symbolic level. All right, so these are quick and incomplete thoughts about what we mean by politics, and I'm sure you could add many other ways to think about it. Somewhat separate, defined in different ways. Is it perennial? Well, not all societies will have one rather than the other. One has to be very careful about overly broad generalizations. All right, so then the next question is, how does this relate to the prevalence of lying? How does it relate to the issue of mendacity? Well, if we look at the first version, we look at the Schmittian notion of antagonism. It's quite clear that in war or in an existential struggle, we don't owe the truth to our enemies. I mean, one of the crucial questions about asking about politics and truthfulness is, to whom is the truth owed? To whom do I owe transparency? To whom must I confess? So in a war situation, one assumes that the enemy is going to be deceived, and that war, and many theoreticians of war will make this very explicit, war operates precisely by deception, and no one will, in any way expect absolute honesty. I mean, apparently there are some groups, I gather the Maori in New Zealand, and some people argue the Quakers, will maintain a, let's say, absolute honesty under all circumstances and not try to deceive their enemies. But it's very clear that in wartime it's perfectly legitimate. So for example, in the Second World War, one of the great examples of this, before the D-Day invasion of Normandy by the Allies from England, false information was given to the Germans about where the landing would take place. They had various ways in which they tried to fool the Germans, and the Germans were in fact fooled. The landing was abetted by the fact the Germans were not aware of where the landing was going to take place. No one says this was unfair, unjust, that they should have told the truth. So clearly, in this situation, this version of politics, an existential struggle to the death, who can blame the occasional misrepresentation? How about agonism? Well, agonism is, in a way, less lethal. It involves less violence. But diplomacy, as we know, is basically a dance of euphemism, a dance of rhetoric, of politeness. It's the place where politesse, in the old courtly sense of tact, becomes the way in which countries interact. I mean, they may have other agendas, they may ultimately lead to serious conflict, but basically diplomacy is the place where people say nice things and think something else. And everybody knows that. So it was Sir Henry Wotton, who was, I think, James I of England's emissary to the court of Venice, who said that a diplomat, or I think he said an ambassador, is an honest man sent abroad to lie for his country. So the implication is that you always basically, and everybody knows that diplomats do this, you act in such a way that you don't tell the unvarnished truth. So even friends, as we know, will sometimes, on the diplomatic level, be very careful about telling the absolute truth. When Snowden disclosed, all of these cables, there was great embarrassment. I remember I had a chance to meet the American ambassador to Germany back in, I think it was 2010, and he had been named in these cables for having told the American government back in Washington what he really thought about German officials, especially the, I think, defense minister, and this then became public. So he was exposed for saying nice things in public to the German officials, but in private telling the Americans back home that he thought they were fools. So we expect our diplomats to be able to report honestly to us. And we don't owe the truth to other countries, even friendly countries. So there is there a kind of space for a certain amount of duplicity. Now, how about the rule of the wise, the rule of the technocrats, the rule of the people who, let's assume they are benign, that they're not doing it for their own interests, they're not corrupt, or they're not interested in power for its own sake, they're doing it out of enlightened despotic benevolence. And here the great example was Plato's notion of the noble lie, genian pseudos, which allowed the rulers to tell a lie, and it's a complicated lie having to do with various orders in society, which meant that you had to accept something which was historical as natural. The content is less important, and the belief that noble people, not only because they were noble in their breeding, but also because their intentions were noble, they had the right to, in a way, benignly deceive the population, to promulgate myths, to create a kind of better outcome which would bypass the ignorance of the people. Now, most of us feel very uneasy with this and don't feel that we want to remain always in the dark, and yet at certain times we recognize that it's useful for certain information, let's call it classified, not to be made at least immediately available. So for example, if there's going to be a stock market panic based on some sort of measure that the government is going to take, that it knows in advance it's going to change the interest rates or do something more drastic, sometimes it's wise for a government to try to avoid that panic by keeping that information hidden, maybe even lying about its intentions. And there probably are other examples as well where one can at least allow a certain latitude for secrets and even public dissembling to take place if we accept the fact that the rulers are doing it for our good rather than for the good of themselves. I mean, this is very much like the example of a doctor who withholds information from a dying patient to keep the patient's spirits up, to prevent the patient from becoming depressed and even suicidal. You say, yes, you may well recover, even though the doctor tells the family in the next room he has 2 weeks to live. So sometimes we give that role that a doctor has to a politician, not that frequently. Now, the most interesting cases, it seems to me, are the cases that have to do with the what I've called Republican realm of political participation, the realm basically of democracy, that on the one hand, and the aesthetic. I'll get back to the aesthetic in a moment. All right, the Republican realm. Now here we get most upset when we assume that instead of our being the participants, we elect people who then betray us by lying to us. Or they get elected by lying before they're elected, and then when they get into power, they do something else. We feel a kind of anger that we're not being allowed to know what is really in their minds, and we get infuriated if they lie about their background or about some of their actions in the past and so forth. Now, there are several ways, and this is, by no means, I think, a mistake. I think we need to hold politicians accountable in a democracy. But there are several ways, when you think about the politics of democracy, in which, nonetheless, there is a certain mendacity or hypocrisy that we know takes place and will nonetheless accept. For example, in the building of coalitions. We know that political parties and governments made of coalitions always involve a commonality of interests that overlap to a certain extent, but not to every extent. That coalitions bring together groups that will agree, well, at times that they can unite, but at other moments they will not be in accord. And this is shown most explicitly in a primary campaign. I'm sure some of you have followed the primary debates on the American campaign with Republicans and Democrats going at each other. Once a figure is selected, all of the anger addressed towards those competitive candidates will be forgotten. And the Republicans will rally around whoever it is. The Democrats will rally around whoever their candidate is. And all of the anger, all of the complaint will be basically, some ways brushed aside. Now, when is the lying taking place? Do they really love one another after the single person is selected? Or is there a kind of bracketing of the hostility, and everybody knows that they still are hostile, and that if for some reason this candidate falters, there'll be at his or her throat the next election. So we're aware of the fact that building coalitions requires a certain amount of duplicity. A good example in international relations, to come back to World War II, when Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sat down to discuss what they were going to do against the Nazis, Churchill's stake in the British Empire was not something that Roosevelt brought up. Roosevelt's stake in capitalism was not something that Stalin brought up. And, Stalin's role in basically tyrannical version of socialism was something that even Churchill, who was very, very much anti-Bolshevik from the get-go, something that Churchill worried about. So there was a kind of marriage of convenience in which these three leaders sat down for a common purpose against a common enemy and lied about their attitude towards the British Empire, towards capitalism, towards the Soviet system, until the Cold War broke out after the end of World War II. So this is typical of politics in the international level and also in the what we might call internal level with democratic politics. There's yet another way in which democratic politics, liberal politics for that matter, also is based on a certain duplicity. And this has to do with the idea of one person, one vote. The idea that everyone is an equal citizen. Everyone is basically in the judicial system equal under the law. Now, in fact, we know that there are socioeconomic and cultural differences. And we know that some people have a lot of money, and they run the system in ways that the rest of us who don't have that money don't. We also know that the law can be used by people who have a lot of money, and it comes down very hard on people who don't. So the famous phrase of Anatole France, where he said that the law in its majesty prohibits both rich and poor from sleeping under a bridge, captures the sense that a kind of legal equality, the equality in the voting booth, is in fact really duplicitous, that we bracket or forget the fact that there are socioeconomic differences. Now, we may hope in a democracy that these will be lessened. We now know, of course, that equality is going in the opposite direction. So there is a certain sense of fooling ourselves, even in a democracy, when we say basically everybody's equal under the law, everybody's equal as a citizen. We know that money speaks, and that poor people are not given the same opportunity. So this is part of, as it were, let's call it the hidden hypocrisy of a democratic system. Until you have full equality, this kind of legal or political equality has a little bit of the sham in it. Now, there are other ways in which one can think of the, let's say, legitimacy or the positive function in a system which we might call democratic of lying. And the one that I want to finish with before I get to the aesthetic is the relationship between the weak and the strong. Now, even in a democracy, and this is, of course, stronger in a totalitarian, authoritarian system, even in a democracy, the powers that exist want to know a lot about you. They want to know all the things they can figure out for purposes of taxation, purposes of control if you're going to be violent, purposes of manipulation one way or another. So surveillance and the, let's say, pressure to confess, the pressure to be vulnerable, transparent, coming from above to below, means that sometimes, instead of saying truth to power, you have to say lies to power. Because even democratic power can be intrusive. And we know with the internet and other forms of big data, and we've heard lectures on this at this very conference, that the ability to probe into our lives is enormous and only growing. So resistance from below is sometimes a necessary part of even a democratic polity. And occasionally that means that we have the possibility of occasionally denying the truth. Now, this has always been, I think, part of even systems before contemporary surveillance. When you take the example of the secret ballot, we take that as something which shows us the limits of governmental intrusion. Secret ballot comes in basically in the 19th century. I'd be interested to know when it actually began in Chile. It begins various places in Britain, the United States, Australia, and other places around the world. And the point about the secret ballot is that I vote in the privacy of my little sort of booth. And if I walk out of the booth and somebody says, "Who'd you vote for?" I don't have to tell the truth. I don't owe you the truth. I'm not compelled to confess. And this is part of the resistance we have to the intrusion of the political system, even in a democracy. And it's one that we value very strongly. And I think it's one of the ways in which secrecy, if not outright lying, has a kind of justification. All right, finally, I want to talk a little about the aesthetic. Hannah Arendt argued that one of the ways in which lying was, in general, a positive human endeavor it was the moment in which, when a child learns to lie at the age of perhaps 3 or whatever, he learns a certain autonomy from the tyranny of the facts, the tyranny of only being able to say what is the case. So that lying is the first time when one gets the sense of freedom to invent, to imagine, to believe in something that is not the case. So lying is the place where a child can live in a world which is not simply one of absolute transparency and gains a kind of interiority which is not transparent to his parents or whoever else asks. Lying also, she argues, is a place where something new enters the world. It's a place where it's possible to think about a different way of being. Now, it could be better, it could be worse, it could be, just indifferent in terms of quality. But it's one of those places where, like art, and of course many people conflate art and lying, they're not the same, we're able to begin to think about possibilities. Lying in politics, she argues, is connected to action, connected to freedom, connected to the possibility to think what is not the case. The other relationship that's important is the relationship between, so Hannah Arendt has argued, a number of her essays, plurality, rhetoric, opinion, differences of opinion on the one hand, and truth, which is essentially monologic on the other. Truth is singular. There is one truth. Everything else is basically error or perhaps something that is simply irrelevant to the truth. In politics, what we have are opinions. What we have are different values. What we have are different interests. And so politics is and this is why it's performative, a struggle or a contest which is endless for power, for some supremacy, but based on the sense of the necessity of keeping the struggle going because your opinion will never be the singular truth. So truth, she says, is in some ways coercive. It tries to filter out and to negate everything which is construed as wrong, and then it gets a kind of moral dimension as evil, and instead argues that I have the truth and you don't. So a politics of truth, not necessarily truthfulness, but a politics of believe that you can find the truth, is a tyrannical politics. So it's better, she argues, to have a politics that is a politics of pluralism, of different opinions, of rhetoric, which of course Plato attacked when he attacked the sophists, a politics which knows that it is only partially true, and is willing, therefore, to tolerate the kind of dance of half-truths and of opinions and of basically claims that are ones that are not absolutely and completely commensurate with something called the truth with a capital T. And to this extent, one might say that the idea of a politics of truth with a capital T, the big truth, is the reverse of the politics of the big lie. It's very interesting that one of the things that we associate with totalitarianism is the notion that the system, whether it be communism or Nazism or fascism or whatever it might be, the system was construed as an alternative whole, as if it were a place apart from the rest of the world in which there was a seamless totality of coherence. It was a system without any internal contradictions, a system that was allegedly total in a way that meant that it was a system of coercion. And this was based on basically a lie, and the idea of the big lie, which Orwell and other people talked about, the idea of the big lie is in a curious way the inverse of the idea of the big truth. And it might be better, in other words, to avoid both of these and to remain content with a series of half-truths, of shaded truth, of a recognition that there are meta levels of we know and yet don't know, a willingness to be, to some extent, more interested in the substance of what a politician is saying, the platform, than the character of the politician as a hypocrite or a liar, the politician who claims he or she is authentic, that he's the truth teller, and I come back to someone like Donald Trump, and that everybody else is somehow filtering it through convention, through the rhetoric of political correctness, that he is the only one who is speaking from the heart, from the gut. That's the politician you have to beware of. That the politician who claims that he is above the lies of the rest of us, that he is pure and above mendacity, is the politician who is going to lead us astray. So just to conclude, I would say this is not a claim that lying is inherently always good. It's not a claim that lying is the default position in politics. It's not a claim that we ought not to see this realm of the political as permeable, so that our roles as moral or religious beings, thinking about the importance of not lying in those contexts, that those don't play a role. I think they do. Or that, and this is my final point, that the political is itself in tense relationship to other, let's call them veridical discourses or institutions, which permeate, although don't completely collapse into the political. The most obvious being journalism on the one hand, and let's call it the academy or science or something that involves disinterested pursuit of knowledge on the other. So in the juridical system, at least in the United States, you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And in politics, you never swear that. And nonetheless, there is a way in which the juridical system interfaces with the political, so that sometimes people are forced to go to court, they're sued, there are ways. I mean, I mentioned the American Constitution giving a space for that not happening, but often it does happen. So there is, I would say, a complicated negotiation between the veridical discourse of the courtroom, which is always, of course, ideal rather than fully realized, and politics. The second is the realm of the academy, of science, of what we might call the disinterested pursuit of knowledge, where opinion doesn't count for much, where testing and verification are important, where the goal of a single truth, rather than a plurality of truths, is one that we can honorably pursue. So if I'm a scientist and I want to know the truth about how to cure AIDS, I don't have 100 different opinions that are equal. I test and I come up, if I'm lucky, with the right answer. So the judiciary, the academic or scientific system, and then finally the third, I would say, impinging neighbor institution that is not equivalent to the political but puts pressure on it from the outside is the fourth estate, as we call it, journalism. Investigative journalism, honest journalism, journalism that's not always already on the side of one party, always in the pocket of a particular politician, and that happens, alas, too often, but journalism that is free. And so a free press capable of asking questions about the truthfulness of the statements made, capable of informing the public about who is, basically making it out of whole cloth and who is giving only a spin. Very, very crucial. One has to have all of these, in a way, surrounding, sometimes permeating the space of the political, but never fully collapsed into it. And it's always variable, it's always historically different to see which of these is potent, which of these is somehow impotent at a certain time in history. But it's a constant struggle to keep this political realm pure enough that the function of mendacity in it, as I've described it, can in a way still thrive and maybe, and this is the sort of unexpected conclusion of all that I'm saying, may do a little bit of good rather than be the unequivocal evil that most of the time people think it is. Okay, that's the argument. Thanks. I'm delighted to hear any questions or objections that people have.